Welcome to CityWorks, a production of the City University of New York School of Labor and Urban Studies and CUNY TV. I'm Laura Flanders. Each month here on CityWorks, we explore the lives of working people on the job, at home, in our communities, in order to see how this metropolis can advance an agenda of social and economic justice. On today's program, we're going to take a close look at housing by examining the New York City Housing Authority, or NYCHA, which was founded back in 1935 and today is the largest public housing authority in North America. 1 in 16 New Yorkers lives in a NYCHA apartment. That's more than 6% of the city's population and makes the projects, as they're called, larger than the cities of Sacramento, Atlanta, and Miami. NYCHA has a workforce of 12,500 people. As of April 2022, though, more than 250,000 families were on the waiting list for a home, an indication of the magnitude of the need for affordable housing here. With an estimated $40 billion in repairs and upgrades required right now, and Congress dropping the ball on help in funding this critical public project, some New York officials are pursuing a, quote, public housing preservation trust. But tenant organizers and their supporters see the trust as a foot in the door for privatization, with rent hikes and evictions to follow, undermining the fundamental purpose of public housing. With me today are two guests. A longtime tenant advocate, Jasmin Sanchez, was born and raised in the NYCHA Baruch Housing Project. The list of her work is extensive and includes membership as well as being the mobilization coordinator for Movimiento Victoria Ciudadano. And she was one among NYCHA residents who launched LES Mutual Aid, Lower East Side, which served 5,000 families in Lower Manhattan at the height of the pandemic. We're also welcoming CUNY SLU professor James Rodriguez, a native New Yorker born and raised in public housing too. Professor Rodriguez is the co-author of Social Capital, Gentrification, and Inequality, which is a chapter in Racial Inequality in New York since 1965. Alongside his teaching and academic research, he has worked as a public housing and land use organizer on the Lower East Side and is active in tenant organizing movements across New York City. I want to welcome both of you, Jasmin and James, to the show. Welcome to CityWorks. Glad to have you.
Thank you.
Because our media, the rest of it, so often presents such a miserable picture of public housing, I'd like you two to start with the other side. What's the unheard, the unreported, perhaps the less well understood side of the story? What's been your experience of growing up and living in public housing?
So living in public housing while I would say the 70s, 80s, and maybe early 90s was phenomenal. I remember stomping on the ground, getting worms, you see the light bugs. There were no repairs needed in the household because if there were a repair, you go down to the management office, it would get fixed immediately. There were more staff members that were available, hence why there were no need for dire repairs. But it was a safe haven for families. You know, a lot of families migrated from Puerto Rico. A lot of families, were African-American families that moved into the communities, such as, the Lower East Side or the Williamsburg area, the South Bronx. And this was truly a stock of affordable housing. And I want to actually take that back, low income housing, right? Because we do know that this is the truly only stock of low income housing in New York City. You mentioned that there's a wait list, right, to get on, and that is also because of the rapid gentrification that's happening in New York City. Folks are not moving out of public housing. They cannot afford to go anywhere else, which is why there is a need to preserve Section 9, which is the federal, notation of it, because we need to have that and we need more of it, right?
James, to you, I mean, I think if I'm right, you have a dissertation in gentrification and policing or something like that.
And public housing, yeah.
Talk a bit about your experience and what you think most people outside of people with the direct experience may have wrong about public housing and NYCHA projects in New York.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. I echo so much of what I heard from Jasmin. Being born and raised in public housing and then going on to do academic research on public housing was really quite jarring because my experiences, and I think the experiences of my friends and family that grew up in the community and other public housing communities are really quite different from the overarching narratives, both in the media and in academia, that really portray a narrative of failure and dysfunction around public housing. And I think that's true in New York, but also of what folks think of as the projects in the country as a whole. And so I think that what gets lost in that narrative is that these are homes and these are communities and these are places that people are building really full lives with their families and with their friends. And I think that a top-down narrative around dysfunction, be it repairs or maintenance, but also related narratives around crime and abuse, have also really been deeply racialized over time. And so in my work and my experience, I think it's no coincidence that in some ways thinking of public housing or the projects has become almost like a vector to speak about low-income Black and brown folks in ways that are really quite still detrimental and really stigmatized of much older types of racialized stereotypes.
Yeah, I mean,
as well.
no one gets stigmatized more than low-income women of color. And that
100%.
tends to be the picture that we have of the problem in public housing and the people who are trying to deal with it. Talk, if you would, James, about what happened. I mean, we just heard from Jasmin. In one era, things were pretty great and fine and not allowed to sort of decline. And then something shifted. What? Was it just overcrowding, underfunding? What, James?
And this is the piece that I think most folks, regardless of where you stand on public housing politically, generally agree, is that we've seen decades of disinvestment from every level of government, from the federal to the state to local levels, that over time have really just eroded the public housing authority in New York City, but also nationwide, right? And so communities that for many years held strong over time began to deteriorate. And with more time, those kind of setbacks in the infrastructure have grown and grown to the $40 billion capital needs that you address that really sums up what NYCHA needs to bring its buildings up to good repair. And so it's really been that really consistent and chronic disinvestment for decades.
So that takes us to this question of who is in charge. I mean, you mentioned Section 9, there's Section 8. I mean, there's federal legislation involved here and federal oversight. And part of what's being discussed now is shifting some of the apartments into some sort of situation that wouldn't be federal any longer. Can you just take us through the basics of this, James? And I'd love you to come in on it too, Jasmin. What do we need to understand? Right now, this is a federal commitment, right?
It's a combination of federal and state commitments, and also to a degree, also local commitments as well. So when we talk about the New York City Housing Authority, there's a lot of current plans on the table and some that are already ongoing that are really looking to privatize the New York City Housing Authority in a number of different ways. These plans, though, they really go back actually almost 2 decades. And they really center on a combination of either opening up public housing lands and grounds to redevelopment from private developers, and also hinge on, as you mentioned, Laura, really changing the institutional structure of public housing by transferring Section 9 public housing, which is the conventional, traditional model that still exists for most of New York City, into the Section 8 model of housing, which is primarily a voucher-based program. And one of the real differences between Section 9 and Section 8 is that Section 8 primarily is a subsidy for landlords and developers. And so that rental assistance goes to landlords and developers to meet that housing need rather than a public-based program that is operated by the state.
And how is it different for the resident? What's their experience? And what is this a section of? Does either of us know?
The HUD Housing Act, yeah,
Right.
it can get convoluted, yeah.
Thank you. So how would it be different for the renter?
Yeah, I also
owner
wanted
herself?
to add to what James had said really quickly, is that we've already experienced what that could look like, right, under RAD, right, where we saw in Ocean Bay houses that once it converted into RAD,
Which was?
the rental assistance demonstration, right? That's
You
what it
got
is.
it. You got it.
But we say real advanced displacement, right? Because we saw that the eviction rates at this one specific public housing development doubled. In regards to any other public housing that was there, right? So it's not a model that works because we see that there are increases in evictions. You're not protected by the same laws as Section 9, as the federal policies.
Because you're getting rental assistance in the form of a voucher.
Yes.
That's the difference, right?
Yeah, the Section 8 voucher, correct.
With respect to the situation that New York is in right now, it's coming out of COVID, how would you describe it, Jasmin? Because it's no question, I don't think you'd contest that it's a crisis.
It is a crisis, specifically around how all of this transpired, right? In the height of a pandemic, we were hit with this presentation that we are introducing, the blueprint, as it was originally called, right? And tenants were not made aware, elected officials were not made aware, and this was an act to privatize without informing the masses. So it is a crisis. It's something that has to be addressed. There are groups on the ground, such as the Residents to Preserve Public Housing, CCOP, which is the citywide council of presidents of all of the public housing in New York City, as well as folks from Safe Section 9, the Movement School, that are really trying to organize around informing residents about their rights, about this bill that's being proposed and how we can, affect change in it, right? You have to have a certain percentage of folks voting if they want to do this, right? We're calling for like 66%. Am I right, James?
Yeah,
that is
supermajority.
Yeah, the majority of it, right? You can't just come in here and say, I met with 10 people and they voted in favor of this, right?
All right, so let's roll back just a second.
Yeah.
Because Jasmin's describing the crisis as this blueprint, the blueprint that was embodied in a bill that was signed by the state legislature last summer that imagines this preservation land trust, as it's called, and as you say, got some surprising support from progressives at the state and local level. Those advocates argue that this trust plan is a response to a crisis, that Congress, as you've just described, is against spending more money on building public housing and is against even funding it. And when Joe Biden tried to get support for public housing in the in the Build Back Better plan, it got stripped out. So am I right so far, James?
Yeah, totally. And I think that part of what makes this narrative so insidious, or rather this trajectory towards privatization so insidious, is because there is a deep fiscal and repair crisis in public housing. And a lot of that has been because of really deep disinvestment across each of these levels in government. Where I think I and many other resident advocates and activists differ in the response is that for officials in the public housing authority and the elected officials that have supported this plan, privatization is pitched as the only solution, as the only viable remedy, right? And so for me, this feels a little bit misguided, right? Because folks are able to, in most ways, accurately diagnose the problem of deep disinvestment, but rather than addressing that solution by actually increasing public investments in public housing, the solution has been to privatize and to essentially find any number of creative ways to put public housing into the hands of private developers.
All right, well, we're going to come back and understand more of the details of how this plan would actually work and what some of the alternatives to this plan might be right after a short break. We're going to be right back with more City Works after this.
The CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies is the 25th and newest school under the CUNY umbrella. Dedicated to public service and social justice, the CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies offers undergraduate and graduate degrees in the areas of labor studies and urban studies, and certificate programs in labor relations, public administration and public policy, healthcare policy and administration, and community leadership. We pride ourselves on being an institution that brings together activists and academics. Find out more at slu.cuny.edu.
Welcome back. We're talking about housing. I'm here with housing advocate and activist, NYCHA resident and longtime organizer Jasmin Sanchez, and SLU professor James Rodriguez. Let's just start by explaining where things stand right now with respect to this Public Housing Preservation Trust, the blueprint that you've talked about. It was passed by the state legislature, signed into law by the governor. What happens next, Jasmin?
Yeah, so right now we have to have a majority of the campuses receive this information, and they have to vote on it. And what we're proposing is a majority vote of 66% of it, right? Also, the language in the trust is very vague. There aren't any definitions about independent audits or audits to be done, right? Also, it's calling for a $10 billion investment in issuance in bonds, which is fiscally irresponsible without a plan if there is a default in it, right? Which means that our homes, I still live in public housing, my home is at risk if there is a default, right? And these are the lives of 1 million New Yorkers. Yeah. So it's a lot.
Now, the idea behind the plan, I think, is for this trust to be able to borrow against some of the apartment revenues. Talk about the perils there that Jasmin's referring to, why you think this is dangerous, and why can't NYCHA housing itself apply for loans? James.
Yeah, I think those are really great questions. I think that there are some bureaucratic rules from NYCHA's status as an agency under HUD that essentially limits the amount that it can borrow. And so for the folks that are behind the Preservation Trust, the idea is to create a new entity, the trust itself, that would then have apartments and property from NYCHA transferred to it. Under this new entity, it would be allowed to shift the existing housing from Section 9 into Section 8 and receive Section 8 housing vouchers. And then this new entity would be able to borrow against the housing voucher income stream that would, in theory, allow for the repairs to be made.
And how are those vouchers calculated?
Through HUD, right? So they're part of HUD Section 8 housing vouchers, which has been a more lucrative revenue stream than Section 9 housing, in part because Section 9 housing has been disinvested so thoroughly over the decades. Section 8, as a housing-based subsidy that landlords and developers are able to partake, has gotten more bipartisan political support over the years. So the idea is that this revenue stream will allow the new entity, the trust, to borrow and issue bonds against that revenue. And so some of the deep pitfalls that residents and activists have identified are a number of issues that are in the legislation proper, which is, one, there's no, as Jasmin alluded to, there's no backstop from the city or the state in the events of default. And the legislation is actually quite clear that any revenue that the trust is able to generate, its creditors are its first priority. So even though repairs and maintenance are seen as the justification, there really will be no repairs or maintenance until the creditors are made whole. So there's been a lot made in the decline in rental collections since the pandemic for public housing residents, which, as Laura mentioned, has dropped to around 65%, which usually hovers around close to 90% pre-pandemic. And so there are a few reasons for that, and a lot of them go back to really state policy, right? So the federal ERAP and the state ERAP, Emergency Rental Assistance Program, was not available to public housing residents. They were put at the very end of the queue. And so those funds for rental assistance that many renters were able to access during the pandemic, none of that money was actually dispersed to public housing residents.
And people didn't understand well that they were not going to be entitled to that because the coverage made it sound like there was assistance. I mean, we're running out of time here, but I want to get back to the basics. I'm hearing from both of you that under this new plan, which, let's be clear, is law but isn't implemented in individual projects yet, under this new plan, you would have the needs of tenants and their families in the community posed against the demands of people who had issued debt, whether it was banks or trust funds or whatever it was. Which brings us back to the basic principles of public housing, which I think is just worth reiterating here. I saw a report from Human Rights Watch the other day about this crisis, about this situation, and I thought, well, that's interesting. The Human Rights Watch, which you think of as dealing with torture and abuse in other countries, is dealing with housing in New York City and globally. I mean, they were talking about the Americas broadly. This is a continental-wide phenomenon. But it comes back to that question of rights. The principles on which public housing was established. Who wants to remind us? And why have we come so far from that? James?
Yeah, I think it's a great way to pose this question. And as you opened our talk with this afternoon, public housing is nearly a century old, and it begins in New York City. And the push and the organizing to create a public housing program in this country really stem from the really deep failures of the private rental housing market to create even the most basic of standard living accommodations for low income and working class folks. And so this current iteration to push and to privatize really is ahistorical in this way, and it loses the real deep need that the state on across each of its levels has to provide housing outside of a commodified privatized rental market, which is the trend that's now being dragged on the New York City Housing Authority.
Anything you want to add to that?
I'd like to add something to that as well. Initially, when public housing was created, it wasn't created for people that look like me. It was for folks coming back from the war. The services that they were offered, such as business creation and development, resources and support, this uphill of, getting out of these communities to move into the suburbs was something that was like promised through all of this. All of these rights that they had, like the folks that returned from the wars had, was not given to people that look like me. Because once we started moving in there, black, brown, folks that were like truly low income people, everyone left us there, and the developments became a disarray, basically, right? The investment had stopped coming in. And that is something that's truly, so Human Rights Watch is actually correct. It is a humanitarian crisis what's happening in public housing right now. The way that the tenants are living right now is horrific. It's just horrific.
And let's remember, the right to housing is in the International Declaration
Correct.
of Human Rights.
Yep.
But this sounds so familiar, that the New Deal had great aspects
Correct.
for white men mostly and their families,
Yep.
but ever since it's been fighting to secure those rights for others.
Yeah.
What happens now? And do you have a message for the surprise progressives who ended up supporting this proposal at the state level? I'm thinking of Julia Salazar, the DSA state senator, and Richie Torres from the Bronx, the representative.
Yeah, the message is that we're not going to take this lying down. Like you say that you're progressive, then you need to side with what the people that are going to be affected by this. You got to side with them, right? One thing that's really important to note is that there is a bill at the federal level, the Green New Deal for Public Housing Act. I always boast about that because it actually took public housing residents' opinions and views into consideration when drafting that. This trust does not do that, right? So if you want support from people that are on the ground, that are living this every single day, then you should have incorporated us to begin with, which they failed to do, which is why there's so much backlash, right? And it's rightfully so, because you're not going to compromise my housing, my stability. My family was redlined, so we've been through this, right? You're not gonna do that because you're thinking that this is the best way. If you don't have a solution, you just don't privatize something, right?
And James, it's not just that the stability of the tenants, also the workforce. We talked about how many people are employed in NYCHA projects. A large proportion of them union workers. This is CityWorks, a union supporting show. What happens to them in this, and have their voices been heard in this debate, for or against? Where do they stand?
Yeah, my understanding from NYCHA workers that I've organized and built with is that they too have been sort of sidelined in these larger trends towards privatization. And so you mentioned at the top of the show that there's around 12,000 folks in the NYCHA workforce, but you go back around 2 decades and that number was actually over 16,000. And so around a quarter of that workforce has also really felt the brunt of the disinvestment, which then has led to the repair and the maintenance issues that have become the crux of imposing a privatization plan that for some folks is seen as the only remedy. So I do think that what also is at stake is not only the residents and public housing, but a huge section of the public workforce also stands to lose really so much of its standing through these proposals.
Do you have an alternative plan in 30 seconds, James?
Yeah, fund public housing. We have the money. We
Right.
put tax subsidy in a number of different places, be it through private development, be it through development for football stadiums in upstate New York. Even on the local level, the budget for the New York Police Department is each year about a quarter of the overall need for the New York City Housing Authority on its own. So between the city, the state, and the federal level, the money exists. And so what we need is a shift in the political will and a true investment in truly affordable and public housing.
Anything you'd add, Jasmine? The Green New Deal for public housing has as its core the messages from the tenants. Is there anything that you want to raise that's in that plan that we need to know about?
Yeah, so everything that we've spoken about, one, there's an independent national advisory from public housing that makes the determination on who receives these contracts. There's a push to invest a minimum of $182 billion. We have money for wars, we have money for policing, we have money for all of these, riot gears, right? We should invest in this. And also, it's the priority of the tenants. It's their voices. It's employing public housing residents as its core of public housing nationally, and also making sure that these jobs are union jobs. So it's going to uplift the green workforce.
All right, thank you both so much. That's it for our show today. Thank you to our guests, Jasmin Sanchez and James Rodriguez. If you have questions or comments, write to us at cityworks@slu.cuny.edu. For CityWorks, I'm Laura Flanders. Thanks for watching.